Adolescence is one of Netflix's latest releases, and it's one of the most talked about shows that's out there at the moment. It jumped straight to #1 in the Netflix charts, and it provided a lot of talking points around the subject matter of the show with regards to incel culture, toxic masculinity, and the impact that your child being a murderer can have on the family. But also, there's been conversations about the way that this show was constructed, with Philip Barantini at the wheel with his signature single-take shots setting the tone, pace, and rhythm for this extremely interesting and dark show. Within the 4 episodes, there was one episode in particular that stood out to me, and it was the 3rd installment. An installment where there were only 4 characters that featured, and the intensity of a character profile being built for pre-sentencing was what the intention of it was. From phenomenal performances to an incredible use of sound to an ending that then left me in complete shock and feeling like all emotions had been drained from me. I wanted to discuss why this episode was simply perfect and explain why it's worthy of all of the praise that it's been getting. So let's get into it. Here is why Adolescence episode 3 is perfect. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Erin Doherty's performance as Briony. Briony was a character that was at the center of this episode, and Erin Doherty delivered a phenomenal performance from start to finish. To be honest, I'd just come off the back of watching 1,000 Blows, and I half expected her to sound like a character that came from the East End, but instead she sounded very posh and proper. So in seeing that range, it instantly made me feel like we were in for one hell of a performance. Erin Doherty, like Owen Cooper, went through a range of emotions in this episode with their character, but it was only at the end of it where we saw that her mask was let down and the emotional weight and turmoil of everything that she'd been through in just needing to be in a room with the killer, Jamie, got the better of her, and she could finally release it all and let out what felt like the largest of metaphorical exhales. When looking at the start of the episode, she was smiley, friendly, and went out of her way to make Jamie feel comfortable in getting him his hot chocolate with marshmallows, even joking with him about their regional differences when it came to slices of bread and their backgrounds. But by the end of it, after she'd been intimidated not once, but twice, her whole demeanor was different, and we saw a more closed-off, stare-you-down approach, which ultimately allowed the character to get what she wanted in being able to profile Jamie. Doherty's performance was extremely intense due to the nature of the character that she was playing, but despite that intensity, there was confidence, believability, sympathy, and fear in knowing that she had to sit across from an evil human being like Jamie with the unpredictable nature that he had. We didn't know anything about Briony other than the profession that she did and the fact that she liked to take things seriously, and I think it takes great skill to make the audience care for a character when there's no true backstory that's known. So I think Doherty's performance was what ultimately enabled that to cut through. The sheer disgust that was on her face at the end and the single tear that ran down it showed that emotional turmoil that she went through in the 5 sessions that she had with Jamie. Plus, I'd also say certain moments where she also shone was when Jamie was revealing what he could have done to Kate, and the room fell silent and all we heard was her heartbeat and her breathing. The stillness on her face and body and the emotionless expression that she held actually spoke 1,000 words, and it was probably one of my favorite moments of Doherty's in this episode. Owen Cooper's performance as Jamie. Considering this was Owen Cooper's first ever acting role, and episode 3 was the first episode that was shot in the entirety of the show, his performance was absolutely class. Not only did we see innocence in the boy at the start with the childlike attitude that he held, but by the closing moments of the episode we saw the evil, toxic, murderous capability that he held within him due to the confrontation and the switch in personalities that happened several times. It genuinely felt like different characters. I mean, look at it. Kind boy that wants a hot chocolate, murderous boy that will stab you 7 times if he doesn't get what he wants. His expressions and tone would just switch on a dime if something was said to him that he didn't quite agree with or made him feel uncomfortable. There would just be this look in his eye and smirk in his mouth that would show that he'd switched, and that child inside of him was gone for those moments. So it was really impressive to see. The coldness in the delivery of lines such as, "Did I scare you when I shouted? I'm only 13. That's embarrassing." It showed the heartless nature that the boy had, and it was the first time we'd seen him acting in such an evil way. As when we first saw him in the first episode when he was arrested, he was scared, pretending to be innocent, and he felt like a child. Another moment from Owen that I thought was great acting was the breakdown that he had when he smashed the hot chocolate across the table, got worked up, and then used that very situation against Briony, and was putting words in her mouth, showing that he knew that he'd messed up by acting like that. Even him being taken away at the end, we really bought into the fact that Jamie wanted that validation from Briony and that he'd become attached to her and formed a genuine connection with her, but he couldn't stand the fact that she didn't actually like him and that it was all just professional. The innocence at the start to the complete guilt that was there by the end showed the true range in the young actor, and it was the time where we really got to see the evil that was within the boy, and Owen Cooper played a large part in that. The use of sound and lighting. This is something in the episode that I feel went under the radar, but contributed massively to the success of it and the immersive nature that it held, as well as the single take shot that was present, which quite literally circled around the table like an interrogation and would then also go in for close-ups when emotions needed to be seen. There were also other mediums that were played with, such as lighting and sound. For example, the speech which connected heavily to Eddie's breakdown in episode 4, where Jamie spoke to Briony about his father taking him to football but him not being any good, and ultimately seeing his father looking away because he was ashamed of him. The background noise in the room fell to complete silence to really allow that piece of dialogue to cut through. Plus, the lighting in the room went a lot darker, showing that we were entering a dark part of Jamie's mind and that it was difficult for him to go to it. Another time this was present was when Jamie was talking about what he could have done with Kate if he actually did what he wanted to. The room fell silent again, but this time with a close-up on Briony, we heard her breathing intensely and her heartbeat pounding as well. Something which really allowed us to capture the fear and disgust that was in her mind, as obviously she couldn't express that to him because she had him right where she wanted him with the answers that he was giving. Another technique on the audio that was used was the incorporation of the static, heavy rain and wind sound that was present in the room. This sound would often rise up in volume when Jamie would get more irate and questions would be asked to him that he wanted to avoid, and often it would then be followed by the silence when he'd answer them. This was something that really allowed the tension to build, and then often when his temper would cause him to fizz over, we were almost ready for it because the sound had subconsciously been preparing us for it. So the use of visuals and audio was something that I definitely appreciated in the episode, and it contributed to the environment and atmosphere. The subject matter of the episode. The whole intention of this episode was one that was really interesting to include into the 4-part series. As the showrunners have said themselves, this wasn't about showcasing the end-to-end process of murder to conviction and then sentencing. This was about showing how it impacted each and every touchpoint along the course of the journey. With this episode being focused around a psychologist entering the facility, meeting Jamie, and aiming to build a profile about his character to work out if he was aware of the situation, the meaning of death, and what being found guilty meant, was a great decision. Especially the fact that we kind of saw him being lured into a false sense of security and ending up admitting what he did by saying, "Where I understand what I did," and then retracting entirely from it and panicking. Even having Jamie saying lines like, "I don't like lying," when the first line we ever heard him say in the very first episode of the show was, "Dad, I haven't done anything," which was an outright lie, was a nice touch. Jamie was relatively closed off about the entire situation for most of the interaction, with him putting his arms in front of him as if it was some kind of shield. But then once he slipped up and then later went on to describe about how Kate was weak and that he saw her weakness as an opportunity and that he could have done anything with that knife, even touched her, but he chose not to. It showed that the writing was done so well because after, it was as if Briony had all of the information that she wanted, and it went from her being friendly with him due to the profession that she was in, to her then switching to be extremely formulaic in her questions and saying, "Thank you for your time," which felt so unemotional and not personal. All done to speed up the process and to enable her to get out of that room as quickly as possible. Showing that not only were victims impacted, families impacted, students and friends impacted, but also professionals that were dealing with the case were impacted too. I actually think the sheer disgust that she was feeling was summed up best when she picked up that sandwich and then realized that Jamie had had his mouth around it and she threw it straight back down to the table, showing that she couldn't touch anything that this evil monster had. Whilst many of the episodes were powerful for a number of different reasons, this episode was really the one that stood out to me. It was the first episode where it contrasted the others in the sense that it was a lot more intimate, and rather than there being chaos about the case and the reaction of everybody that could have been directly impacted, it was more so just about understanding Jamie's mind. Honestly, it was the perfect episode of the show, and it's one that's going to live long in the memory when I think back to it. So, there you have it, why Adolescence Episode 3 is perfect.